Hey everyone, so today we're going to be talking about the development of gender and social roles. And I know this is a very sensitive and societally has been a very sort of controversial subject due to the evolving nature of what we understand about gender and social roles. So, um, you know, please, as we go along here, always keep an open mind um, to learning about this. And this is by no means a completely um, comprehensive list of all the theories that are out there about gender and social roles. So, gender and social roles are important because it makes up part of the ways that an individual sees themselves. And at the very base level, we have sex, which is the biological, um, you know, chromosome-based definition of who you are as a person. But the ways in which we express this biological sex in terms of processing information and how we interact with people is part of gender. And there are social and psychological characteristics of being male or female. And gender roles are the norms that dictate the types of behavior that are considered to be acceptable within a given society in terms of the sex of the individual. So we're going to talk about the what determines personal gender identity, and among these include our own personal awareness of physical changes that are taking place, particularly around puberty, so bringing us from childhood into adolescence. The other one are the social expectations from society in terms of how boys and girls should behave. So, for example, when a boy is becoming a man, this is often a socioculturally driven thing, right? In a hunter-gatherer society, which we are not part of, the rite of passage might be very clear, right? It may be tied to, for instance, killing large animals for your measure as a man. However, it may be more complex in Western societies. Do we base this on age, like 18? Do we base this on independence when you move out of the house? Do you base this on financial stability, being able to pay for your own things? These are very much up for debate. And psychologists debate the degree to which male and female differences are the result of biological differences or social rules. Um, because in the ideas of many, is masculinity a social construction because so many people practice different forms of masculinity, or is it biologically created? Another nature versus nurture argument. Now, in terms of the biologically based theory of gender role development, this is focusing on the nature part of this argument. This perspective holds that males and females are physically programmed for activities and behaviors that are compatible for male and female roles in society. So even in terms of the hormones that um, girls and boys have, testosterone for boys, estrogen for girls. In this view, these hormones are of primary importance and social learning becomes secondary, right? If you are a boy and you have regular production of testosterone, then this view would say that that is what is driving certain behaviors that you exhibit. Same for girls. And then two scientists, the difference between how boys and girls generally play also alludes to the roles that they will be expected to play biologically. So for boys, rough and tumble play, it may be practice for competition for scarce resources, including mates. Um, and then also girls, complex social interactions, maybe practice for the nurturing roles of caring for children. And this may have an evolutionary bias or basis as well in terms of how we have continued to develop over time. I will say that there's no hard and fast rules with this um, because there's, a span of human development, but in terms of quote unquote normative human development, this is what they're referring to. Now, these biological explanations also pointed to evolutionary theories on behavior. And these claimed, and this is a claim, not necessarily hard and fast, that the gender roles developed out of the needs of early societies. And so the male advantage was physical strength. And so males were put into situations where they had to attract a desirable female mate, pass genes on to the next generation, and then also demonstrate a capacity for supplying food to children. And then women focused on nurturing selves to attract a quality mate and later nurturing children. And so we are both sort of preparing ourselves for that next step to enable the species to survive. And genetics continued to encourage those behaviors, even if they look contextually different in today's society, right? So for males, this may not be hunting mastodons, but having a good job and proving that you can pay for stuff. That's just one example. Sorry for the pause there. The biological theories are also supported by studies of animals like dogs. And studies have shown womb-based exposure to sex hormones can cause lifelong effects on gender-related behavior for the individual as well. So that may lead to some changes in that paradigm. Now, in terms of cognitive-based theories of gender role development, these theories were on the effect of cognition on gender role development, included looking at the way that children process gender-related information. And research in this area has really focused on two main questions. What is the main cognitive trigger of gender identity? And then what is the cognitive mechanism that is responsible for the formation of gender identity? So that leads us into our first theory today. And this is from Kohlberg in 1966. Herb Kohlberg was a famous psychologist who also founded a theory on moral development. And to Kohlberg, the development of gender identity went through three stages. The first is gender labeling, 2 years old. So this is when children can identify themselves and other people as boys or girls. However, they also believe that gender changes when physical appearance changes. So if a boy put on a dress, then he becomes a girl. And that gender can also change in time. Gender stability was the second stage, and this happened at about the age of 4 years old. So this is when children recognize that gender is stable in time, right? So girls will one day grow up to be possible mothers or boys possible fathers, but they still see gender as something that can be changed by context. And then the third one happens at about the age of 5 to 7, gender consistency. Gender is truly perceived as stable in these times and constant regardless of the changes in physical appearance. However, I would say that we've learned that people's conception of gender can also change past that as well. And so just to finish off talking about Kohlberg for a second, collectively all these stages are known as gender constancy. And we talked about gender constancy when we talked about SLABY and FREY. But this idea of gender constancy, I don't know if all people are going to be constantly within the same gender. I would say that some people's gender identity is still being formed past the age of 7. So the trigger for the development of true identity of oneself is understanding of gender constancy. And there are a few mechanisms of development that help this along. And one is cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance is a discomfort experience when one's behaviors are inconsistent with one's beliefs. And so in order to avoid this discomfort, people would normally try to change either their belief or their behavior, right? So people's gender identity might come from a place of, in this example, I'm a boy, boys do not play with dolls, so why am I playing with dolls, right? Either I need to change my belief and decide that I'm actually a girl, or change my behavior and stop playing with dolls. And so this internal tension oftentimes can, change people's behaviors over time. And also, like we talked about, change people's beliefs as well. Now that does lead us into SLABY and FREY, a study we've seen a couple times. So the aim of this study was to investigate the role of gender constancy in the attention given to same-sex models. And so they took 55 children, ages 2 to 5. It was a correlational study, and they wanted to see the level of gender constancy that was assessed through an interview. And following the interview, children were shown a film in which a man and a woman engaged in different activities at the same time. And what they studied was the amount of time that each child would look at someone of the same gender. So boys low on gender constancy looked at the male model about 48% of the time in terms of forming their behaviors and looking at how they were socialized. And then boys high on gender constancy looked at male models about 61% of the time, and the opposite was true for girls. And so gender constancy, as a conclusion, was an important milestone in the development of gender identity. It triggers selective attention to same-sex models, and that, as we talked about with Bandura, and we'll talk about later with Bandura, can lead to our own behavioral development. The results of the study also suggest that cognitive factors in the development of gender identity precede social factors. So the social learning of gender is not actually possible until the child selectively pays attention to same-sex models. Now, gender schema theory is another theory here, and gender schemas are rooted in society's beliefs about how boys and girls are expected to behave. Children form and develop their gender roles as they receive affirming or disapproving feedback on how their behavior fits what is socially desirable for their gender. And these schemas influence the way the child processes subsequent information in terms of which behaviors are gender compatible and which are not. And this can lead to possible cognitive dissonance as well. If you are someone who's raised in a heavily masculine environment where you are expected to be, your socialized behaviors are expected to be that boys are tough, right? And you feel like you're a little bit more sensitive to other people's needs, then that may lead to greater cognitive dissonance between what you've been taught and what your supposed beliefs are and the person you are, right? And that can affect emotion in all sorts of ways. Gender schemas also influence child self-esteem. Studies from the 90s, so these are almost 30 years old at this point, have found that 10 to 11-year-olds who conformed least to their gender stereotype were often the least popular, right? And this goes back to the example I just used before. If you're a little bit more sensitive than the boys around you, and sensitivity is considered a non-masculine trait, then you might be more outcasted. Peer pressure also reinforces the gender stereotypes and from there gender schema. So there's the cognitive element. Gender schemas can also determine how boys and girls process the same information. So like errors in memory, errors in recall have appeared in research as the result of information that is outside the framework of the children's gender schema. Allport and Postman used a racial example for theirs, but the same could work for gender schema as well. And so cognitive explanations have also been called into question because children have shown marked preferences for toys associated with their gender before acquiring complex gender role schemas. So it may point to some biological explanations. And then schema development might also be prompted by sociocultural rather than cognitive elements, as we saw with peer pressure, which is a sociocultural element. There's also a sociocultural based theory of gender role development, and this tends to connect with social learning theory. So if we are talking about gender and social learning theory, gender roles are learned and developed through interacting with the environment and then modeling those behaviors of the same gender. So children end up observing role models of the same sex and imitate their behaviors if they can see them leading to gender roles associated with desirable consequences. And so Bandura, who again came up with this theory, he ended up expanding his ideas to say that the child chooses what role and resulting behaviors they would like instead of society determining that for them. And so the child ends up choosing which role models to imitate, right? They could choose someone who's heavily masculine as deemed by society, someone who is considered to be less masculine, someone who's considered feminine or very feminine. All of these choices of whose attention they are, whose information they are paying attention to, really can change their behaviors. And then gender socialization by parents. Obviously, parents are a huge factor in the gender socialization of the child. And this is connected to social cognitive theory. So this being in line with Bandura, he claimed that gender socialization can occur through either what is called direct tuition, where adults reinforce behavior that is consistent with gender stereotypes, or vicarious learning. So children observe others displaying gender consistent behavior and get reinforced for that. And so we're going to look at the Bobo doll experiment, but in imitating aggressive behavior, children had a tendency to imitate same-sex models. And so even in Bandura, this is a part of the socialization of gender that is occurring here. So again, Bandura was the Bobo doll experiment. They took 36 boys, 36 girls, ages 3 to 6, put them in a room where they got to observe either the adult hitting the Bobo doll and being aggressive with the Bobo doll, or just cleaning up toys. And what ended up happening, again, when we're talking about gender socialization, the boys were more likely to imitate the physical aggression from men. Girls were more likely to imitate verbal aggression from women. So even in these cases, there's a sociocultural component of gender. Now, we can also not only be socialized in terms of gender by our parents, but also in terms of our peers. And when children have greater numbers of playmates available, they're more likely to form sex-segregated peer groups, right? Even as elementary school kids. If you think about elementary school, I certainly remember boys talking about girls having cooties, and then boys having cooties as well, right? So you are very much segregated on the basis of sex. And so what this does is reinforce behavior more and more as being gender typical, right? Where it's matching what the societal definitions for how boys and girls should act. That does not mean that they have to act that way. And then where peer groups are not so sex segregated, children tend to not exhibit as much gender-based behavior. So my sister had a friend next door who was a boy, who was her age, and they were like best friends growing up. And I would say often you'd see the boy next door playing with dolls with my sister, or my sister going and out in the yard and getting dirty, and each doing things that societal you know norms have deemed to be either masculine or feminine. There wasn't as much of a strict segregation between those activities. And In terms of moving on to the next point, it has been shown that gender-related differences in behavior are most obvious when children play in sex-segregated groups, right? And so there's a certain level of peer influence involved in gender socialization. So really, what we're talking about here as well is that even though a child may exhibit the most gender-related differences, where they are very masculine in a group of very masculine children, or very feminine in a group of very feminine children, when they are away from those peer groups, those differences don't seem to matter as much. And then gender socialization by peers occur when gender consistent behaviors are reinforced. They're both directly and vicariously reinforced by other children, right? Like, that's not what boys do. That's not what girls do. Those sorts of things can really affect our own gender socialization. All right, I understand that this topic is a little bit more controversial, and we're learning more about what constitutes gender every day. If you have any questions, concerns, would like to talk more about areas where either you're confused or you would like to talk more about some of these topics, please come find me. And I hope all of you have a great day.